In the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Alaska, a terrifying predator stalked his victims, but this was no ordinary killer. His hunting grounds were the Alaskan wilds, and his prey were women whose lives would vanish without a trace until the truth came to light. This is the story of Robert Hansen, a man who hid behind a respectable facade as a baker, all while leading a secret life as one of America's most chilling criminals. But how did a mild-mannered family man become a monster? How did he lure at least 17 women into his deadly trap? Stick with us as we uncover the dark secrets of the Butcher Baker, a man whose horrifying acts would forever haunt the icy landscape of Anchorage, Alaska. Born on February 15, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa, Robert Christian Bose Hansen seemed like any other boy growing up in small-town America. The eldest of 2 children, he was raised by strict Danish parents who ran a local bakery. On the surface, Robert's life appeared ordinary, but lurking beneath the surface were the signs of a troubled soul. His father, Christian Hansen, was a tough and demanding man, expecting Robert to help with the bakery from a young age. This burden, combined with Robert's painful stutter and severe acne, made him a target for bullying, but as the taunts grew, so did his anger. It was in this anger, and in the isolation he felt, that the seeds of darkness began to grow. At 14, Robert found solace in the wilderness. He became an avid hunter and archer, drawing power from his ability to control life and death in the wild. But what was once a hobby to escape his torment soon became a dangerous obsession. Though Robert seemed to be a quiet loner type growing up, it's what happened in his formative years that would shape the terrifying man he would later become. How could a man like this transform into the Butcher Baker of Anchorage? The chilling truth lies just beneath the surface. The first spark of Robert Hansen's twisted journey into darkness was lit in the small town of Pocahontas, Iowa, December 7th, 1960, an evening that would change his life forever. But what drove a young man to set fire to a school bus garage? Was it just youthful rebellion, or something much darker brewing beneath the surface? Before he became the infamous Butcher Baker, Robert Hansen was a man driven by anger and a need for revenge. A man whose broken childhood and shattered self-image would lead him down a path of harm and destruction. But his first brush with the law was just the beginning of a much more sinister tale. Join us as we unravel the events that set Robert Hansen on the path to becoming one of America's most notorious criminals. Growing up in the quiet town of Pocahontas, Robert Hansen felt the sting of isolation. Bullied for his stutter, tormented by his severe acne, and rejected by his peers, he was a quiet loner who could never escape the shadow of his overbearing father. But the emotional scars he carried were only the beginning. In 1960, Robert's rage would erupt. Fueled by years of bullying and resentment, he set fire to a school bus garage in what can only be described as an act of vengeance. The flames he ignited that night were a reflection of the fury that had been smoldering within him for years. The fire would land Robert Hansen in Anamosa State Penitentiary, where he would spend 20 months of a 3-year sentence. But even behind bars, the man who would later become the Butcher Baker showed signs of a deeply disturbed mind. Diagnosed with manic depression and periodic schizophrenic episodes, Hansen's psyche was unraveling, and yet the system failed to truly recognize the depth of his madness. But it wasn't just the fire that marked Robert's descent into darkness. It was his obsession with getting back at those who had wronged him, a pattern that would follow him throughout his life. In 1967, after his release from prison, Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska, with his second wife, a woman he had married in 1963. A new beginning in the harsh, isolated terrain of the Alaskan wilderness. To outsiders, he appeared to be just another small-town guy trying to make a living. But in reality, he was already a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In Anchorage, Hansen seemed like a mild-mannered man. He was well-liked by his neighbors, a local businessman who ran a bakery. He even set local hunting records, gaining respect for his skills in the wild. But behind the scenes, the man who had once burned down a building in anger was planning something far more sinister. While he built his reputation as a respectable baker, Hansen's true nature lurked beneath the surface, waiting for the right opportunity to emerge. And it wasn't long before that opportunity came knocking. In December 1971, Robert Hansen's violent tendencies began to surface once again. He was arrested twice, first for attempting to abduct and harm an unnamed housewife, then for assaulting a sex worker. These were not isolated incidents, but a sign of what was to come. In the first case, Hansen's target was a housewife, a woman he tried to abduct and assault. In the second, it was a sex worker, another woman whose life would be forever scarred by his hands. But Robert Hansen's charm and manipulation were not enough to stop the authorities from catching him. Hansen pleaded no contest to assault with a deadly weapon in the housewife's case, and the assault charge involving the sex worker was dropped as part of a plea bargain. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but after serving only 6 months, he was released on a work release program. But here's where things get chilling. Robert Hansen's time behind bars wasn't enough to deter him. If anything, it seemed to fuel his rage. By 1976, he had committed another crime, this time stealing a chainsaw. For that, he was sentenced to another 5 years in prison and ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment. But once again, the system let him slip through the cracks. Despite his criminal record, Hansen was able to rebuild his life in Anchorage. By day, he was a baker. By night, he was a hunter. Of a very different kind. His next victims would be women. Vulnerable women, often sex workers or runaways, whom he could lure into his trap. Hansen's first victims would become nothing more than prey. His method was chillingly simple. Lure them in with promises of money or safety, then abduct, assault, and eventually murder them. But Hansen wasn't finished yet. He would take his victims to the desolate Alaskan wilderness, where the hunt would begin. What made Hansen even more terrifying was his use of the Alaskan wilderness as his hunting ground. He would release his victims into the wild, then chase them down like animals. It was a sick, twisted game of life and death, one that would continue for over a decade. The wilderness of Alaska, a place of breathtaking beauty, but also of darkness and danger. It was here, amid towering trees and frozen ground, that Robert Hansen began his reign of terror. Between 1972 and 1983, Hansen abducted, attacked, and ended the lives of at least 17 women. But what made him so chilling? And how did the cold, unforgiving landscape become his hunting ground? In this part of our story, we dive into the terrifying details of Robert Hansen's murders. His disturbing method of hunting his victims in the Alaskan wilderness is as sickening as it is unimaginable. But what finally led to his capture? And how did one brave survivor defy the odds, bringing him to justice? Stick with us as we unravel the spine-chilling truth. It's believed that Robert Hansen began his killing spree around 1972. His method, well-planned, methodical, and terrifying. Hansen would stalk women, learning their routines and habits. He would pick his victims carefully, often choosing those who were vulnerable, like young sex workers or teenagers. Then, he would strike. His first victim, 18-year-old Celia Van Zanten, on December 22, 1971. Celia was abducted, taken to the wilderness where she desperately tried to escape, only to freeze to death. But even though Hansen's killing method matched that of Celia's death, there was no concrete evidence linking him to her murder. Celia's tragic end would go unsolved, but it was the first inkling of the horrors that would follow. But Celia's death was just the beginning. For the next decade, Hansen's method remained chillingly consistent: abduct, torment, hunt, and that's exactly what he did to his next victims. He would drive them to his home, chain them up, and torment them. And then, once they were broken, he would take them to the wilderness and hunt them down like wild game. Hansen's weapon of choice? A Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle, a hunting knife, and his own twisted mind. Once in the wilderness, he would release his victims, forcing them to run for their lives before stalking them, playing out his gruesome version of a hunter and prey scenario. The results were often fatal. Many of his victims were never seen again, their bodies hidden deep within the Alaskan wilderness. But in 1983, one victim would survive, and it would change everything. Her name was Cindy Paulson, a 17-year-old sex worker who would manage to escape the clutches of Robert Hansen, an escape that would finally lead authorities to him. On June 13, 1983, Hansen offered Cindy Paulson $200 for oral sex. She got in his car, but once inside, the situation quickly turned terrifying. Hansen pulled a gun, drove her to his home, and held her captive. He chained her up in the basement, attacked and tormented her, then made plans to take her to his remote cabin in the wilderness. But Cindy was resourceful. She saw an opportunity when Hansen was distracted, unloading his plane. With no hesitation, she crawled out of the car and ran, barefoot, handcuffed, and terrified. The night had turned into a race for her life. Cindy bolted down the street, flagged down a passing truck, and managed to escape Hansen's grip. She made it to a nearby inn, where she desperately begged the clerk to call her boyfriend. Meanwhile, the truck driver, alarmed by Cindy's appearance, called the police. It was Cindy's bravery that started the unraveling of Robert Hansen's twisted empire. But even with her testimony, police were hesitant to believe her. After all, Hansen was a well-liked local baker, an upstanding member of the community. He had an alibi, but one detective refused to let the case go. Detective Glenn Floth of the Alaska State Troopers had been investigating a series of unsolved murders of women in and around Anchorage. The first body, found near Eklutna Road, was dubbed Eklutna Annie, but there were others: Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and they all seemed to have one thing in common. They were murdered in similar ways. His first victim, 18-year-old Celia Van Zanten. On December 22, 1971, Celia was abducted, taken to the wilderness where she desperately tried to escape, only to freeze to death. But even though Hansen's killing method matched that of Celia's death, there was no concrete evidence linking him to her murder. Celia's tragic end would go unsolved, but it was the first inkling of the horrors that would follow. But Celia's death was just the beginning. For the next decade, Hansen's method remained chillingly consistent: abduct, torment, hunt, and that's exactly what he did to his next victims. He would drive them to his home, chain them up, and torment them. And then, once they were broken, he would take them to the wilderness and hunt them down like wild game. Hansen's weapon of choice? A Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle, a hunting knife, and his own twisted mind. Once in the wilderness, he would release his victims, forcing them to run for their lives before stalking them, playing out his gruesome version of a hunter and prey scenario. The results were often fatal. Many of his victims were never seen again, their bodies hidden deep within the Alaskan wilderness. But in 1983, one victim would survive, and it would change everything. Her name was Cindy Paulson, a 17-year-old sex worker who would manage to escape the clutches of Robert Hansen, an escape that would finally lead authorities to him. On June 13, 1983, Hansen offered Cindy Paulson $200 for oral sex. She got in his car, but once inside, the situation quickly turned terrifying. Hansen pulled a gun, drove her to his home, and held her captive. He chained her up in the basement, attacked and tormented her, then made plans to take her to his remote cabin in the wilderness. But Cindy was resourceful. She saw an opportunity when Hansen was distracted, unloading his plane. With no hesitation, she crawled out of the car and ran, barefoot, handcuffed, and terrified. The night had turned into a race for her life. Cindy bolted down the street, flagged down a passing truck, and managed to escape Hansen's grip. She made it to a nearby inn, where she desperately begged the clerk to call her boyfriend. Meanwhile, the truck driver, alarmed by Cindy's appearance, called the police. It was Cindy's bravery that started the unraveling of Robert Hansen's twisted empire. But even with her testimony, police were hesitant to believe her. After all, Hansen was a well-liked local baker, an upstanding member of the community. He had an alibi, but one detective refused to let the case go. Detective Glenn Floth of the Alaska State Troopers had been investigating a series of unsolved murders of women in and around Anchorage. The first body, found near Eklutna Road, was dubbed Eklutna Annie, but there were others: Joanna Messina, Sherry Morrow, and they all seemed to have one thing in common: they were murdered in similar ways. Floth contacted the FBI for assistance. Special Agent John Douglas provided an offender profile, suggesting that the killer might be an experienced hunter with low self-esteem, someone who kept souvenirs from his victims, like jewelry. And then, the breakthrough came. Using the profile, Floth and his team turned their attention to Robert Hansen. He fit the description perfectly: a man who had the means, a plane, a secluded cabin in the wilderness, and the motive. In October 1983, a warrant was issued to search Hansen's property. What they uncovered was beyond chilling. In Hansen's attic, they found jewelry belonging to several of the missing women, and behind his headboard, a map marked with 37 X's, each one corresponding to a site where a body had been found. The evidence was damning. Hansen could no longer deny his crimes, and when confronted with the physical evidence, he began to confess. Each revelation was more horrifying than the last. Hansen admitted to murdering dozens of women over a span of years, his bloodlust growing with each victim. Robert Hansen's monstrous spree left a trail of devastation across Alaska. Known to have attacked and assaulted over 30 women, Hansen admitted to murdering at least 17. However, investigators believe his victim count may be as high as 37. Many of Hansen's victims were young women, lured with promises of money for photography or companionship. Once abducted, they were subjected to unimaginable horrors before being cruelly killed. Some of Hansen's victims have become etched into the annals of true crime. Each represents a life stolen, a future extinguished. Celia Beth Van Zanten, just 18 years old, vanished on December 22, 1971. Her body was found 3 days later, discarded in a ravine near Chugach State Park. She had been assaulted, bound, and left to die from exposure. Despite evidence suggesting Hansen's involvement, he denied responsibility. Megan Siobhan Emmerich, age 17. On July 7, 1973, Megan Emmerich disappeared from a boarding school in Seward, Alaska. She was last seen leaving a dormitory laundry room. An X on Hansen's aviation map pointed to the area. yet her remains have never been found. Mary Kathleen Thill, age 22. Mary Thill, a resident of Seward, vanished on July 5, 1975, after visiting a bakery. Hansen admitted to killing her and disposing of her body in Resurrection Bay, yet no trace of Mary has ever been recovered. Sherry Morrow, Paula Goulding, and Sue Luna were among the many who fell victim to Hansen's calculated brutality. Most were exotic dancers or sex workers, targeted because Hansen believed they wouldn't be missed. But one woman, Cindy Paulson, survived. Her courage and quick thinking led to Hansen's capture and saved countless others from his grasp. Hansen's crimes have left an indelible scar on the families of his victims and the community of Alaska. Forensic advancements and tireless efforts by law enforcement have brought closure to some, but many women remain unidentified or missing to this day. With Robert Hansen in custody and the overwhelming evidence piling up, the case was set to go to trial. But even as investigators worked tirelessly, Hansen's public persona complicated the process. How could this mild-mannered baker, a husband and father, be capable of such heinous crimes? As the trial date approached, the community of Anchorage was rocked by the revelations. The man they had trusted to bake their bread had, in secret, become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. With Robert Hansen's arrest in October 1983, the stage was set for one of the most chilling criminal trials in Alaska's history. Investigators, armed with damning evidence, knew they had caught the man responsible for terrorizing the Alaskan wilderness for over a decade. Hansen's defense team tried to portray him as a man misunderstood, claiming his violent tendencies were the result of childhood bullying and humiliation. But the prosecution painted a much darker picture, a predator who meticulously planned each crime, using his charm and community, standing to avoid suspicion for over a decade. Crucial to the prosecution's case was the testimony of Cindy Paulson, the only known survivor of Hansen's attacks. Her bravery in recounting the harrowing details of her abduction left a profound impact on the court. Cindy described how Hansen had shackled her in his basement, assaulted her, and then attempted to fly her to his remote hunting grounds. Her escape, made possible by her quick thinking and determination, became the turning point in the investigation. But it wasn't just Cindy's testimony that sealed Hansen's fate. The physical evidence, ballistics matching his rifle, jewelry belonging to his victims, and most damning of all, the aviation map marked with grave sites, left no room for doubt. But despite the mountain of evidence, Hansen initially pleaded not guilty. It wasn't until the prospect of a full trial threatened to expose every gruesome detail of his crimes that he changed his plea. In February 1984, Hansen pleaded guilty to 4 murders: Sherry Morrow, Joanna Messina, Paula Goulding, and Eklutna Annie, as part of a plea bargain. The agreement spared him the death penalty in exchange for his cooperation in identifying the locations of other victims. As investigators pressed him for answers, Hansen's confessions revealed the depths of his depravity. He described his methodical approach, choosing victims, flying them to remote locations, and hunting them like animals. The courtroom was a grim theater where the details of Hansen's crimes were laid bare. Families of victims watched in anguish as the man responsible for their heartbreak finally faced justice. In the end, Robert Hansen was convicted of the murders of at least 4 women. He received a sentence of 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole, an unequivocal condemnation ensuring he would never again walk free. Hansen spent the remainder of his life in prison. His once unassuming demeanor as a baker and community member was replaced by the legacy of a predator whose crimes shocked the world. In interviews from prison, Hansen showed little remorse, deflecting blame and minimizing his actions, but his confession and the physical evidence left no doubt about the horrors he had inflicted on his victims and their families. Robert Hansen's trial and conviction were a turning point, not just for the victims' families, but for the broader understanding of serial crimes in remote and isolated areas. While justice was served, the scars left behind by Hansen's reign of terror remain. The trial brought closure for some, but many families continue to search for answers, as the identities of several victims remain unknown to this day. The marks on Hansen's map may fade, but the stories of his victims will endure. They remind us that even in the darkest of mysteries, justice and remembrance shine brightest, and so, the twisted tale of Robert Hansen comes to an end, but countless mysteries and chilling stories remain untold. From forgotten crimes to spine-chilling legends, we're just scratching the surface. If you're ready to dive deeper into the macabre, uncover the horrifying truths, and explore the darkest corners of human nature, then you've come to the right place. Don't miss out on the stories that will keep you up at night. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to join us on our journey into the unknown, because some stories are too dark to stay hidden.